In Print Radio. In Print is a professional writers organization located in Rockford, Illinois. We're dedicated to providing resources and education off the page and on the air. Hello, I'm Bob Francis. Today, In Print member Eddie Resner sits down with author Laura Enright.
Welcome, Laura Enright, and thank you for talking with us about your writing projects.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
We're going to review some of your personal history and then get into your various writing projects, and then at the end we'll summarize some of the approaches you use to developing characters and creating scenes. Tell us about your most recent project. What is it?
That's a vampire novel, because every writer should have one vampire novel in their stores, it seems at least. So I've been working on it. I started it several years ago, and it's now blossomed into a series. So I just recently was able to find a publisher for the first book in the series. And they're in Nottingham, England, and it's Dagda Publishing.
Great. I could imagine there's a lot of drama and conflict in those vampire stories. We've seen quite a bit of it now. Is there anything different in your approach or in your story?
I think one of the differences is I didn't actually have a burning desire to write a vampire novel. It just came about because I was actually trying to romance a little, an agent that I was interested in trying to get. I had sent him a few things, and he liked my writing. He liked the things I sent him, but not enough to represent them. So I noticed on his website that he handled some vampire fiction, and I thought, well, you know what, I'll give it a shot. I'll try writing a vampire novel. And I really ended up liking the universe I created, and I kind of fell in love with the characters, and I just could not stop writing stories for this particular universe. So it just kind of came out of the blue, but I ended up really liking it.
Well, where's the setting in, and do you have a storyline?
Oh, sure, yeah. The setting is actually present-day Chicago. The vampire, the main character, is is a chef in Chicago. He's a pretty popular chef. Back in World War I, he was from India. He joined the British Army because he actually wanted to go to Europe and learn the art of cooking. And he wasn't sure if he could afford it or his family could afford to send him. So he joined the British Army, which they did at the time, and there were a number of Indians that actually fought in the trenches in Europe, and they sent him to Europe. In the trenches, he meets a kind of an arrogant captain, a British captain who ultimately becomes his nemesis, named Reg Jameson. He also meets a very nice young private named Fred Blythe, and they become friends. At one point, they go over the top, and that's when trouble begins, because he's cut down. At the time, the whole thing was to try to get to the other side, basically. So both sides would occasionally have these times of trying to get over the top and get over to the other side, but it never really worked because this vast stretch of no man's land left them open to mortars and snipers and such. So a lot of times the bodies would remain in no man's land once they were cut down. It's kind of a little gruesome tale, a little gruesome part of World War I. In my tale, he's one of the ones who's, Narain Khan is one of the ones who's cut down, and when he awakens later, it's at night, and he sees these ghoulish figures going around the dead and the dying, and it turns out that they're feral vampires. There are two types of vampires in my story, sentient and feral, and ferals are the ones whose minds didn't really stay with them during the transition. Sentients are vampires that can walk among regular people and pretend that they're regular people, but ferals can't. Narain is attacked. He becomes a vampire. So through the decades, he has to deal with this whole thing. He finds a woman that I guess you would say understands him, and they become a couple. And they discover not everyone turns into a vampire when they're attacked. They discover that Sophie, this woman, is one of the people who doesn't turn into a vampire. So she becomes his food source, basically. It helps him live as normal a life as possible, and that's why he's able to become a really popular chef and open a restaurant in Chicago and such. When it opens, this is kind of told in a flashback, when the story opens, it's present-day Chicago, and Lorraine has reached a crossroads because Sophie died the year before, and she had, through the years, stored up some blood for him, but now he's run out of that. And so he's now faced with having to go out and hunt again for food, which is something he hasn't had to do in like 70 years. So he himself says, I've become complacent about this. It's something he doesn't want to do. He doesn't have to kill for food, but he finds it very disgusting and, against his morals. It's like pickpocketing to him. So that's where it starts. And Reg Jameson comes back into the story, because we discover that he has become a vampire, and Lorraine might have had a hand in that. Fred Blythe comes back in the story. There's a mutant vampire, and on top of that, Lorraine has fallen in love again with a young, I'm trying to think of the term, she specializes in DNA, that he meets at a benefit. Her name is Cassie, and it turns out that she might have a connection with his past that he never realized. But he has to figure out if he wants to get involved with anyone again, because it's, as he says, it's not something you easily talk about over a third date.
Are there any hidden meanings in the names, like Sophie or Don Amato, or do you have any metaphors or messages that you include
Not really
in
in
the
the names per se. I mean, Dom Amato, actually, the last name was from somebody I went to school with, and Dom Amato is Lorraine's business partner, because Sophie and Lorraine decided they needed to have a business partner, somebody who could do business during the daylight hours, basically, and help Lorraine. I just wanted somebody that had kind of a feel for Chicago, name that might have had feel for Chicago. He himself is from Melrose Park.
Well, let's switch to your ebook novel, Trouble. It's sci-fi and comedy with some Western overtones. I like combinations such as this. Does history repeat itself, sort of?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, you do some planet hopping and things of that nature.
Well, I mean, Trouble is something that's the name of the novel, Trouble. Trouble was a novel I wrote about 10 years ago, actually, and it's a lot. It was a lot of fun. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stainless Steel Rat series by Harry Harrison. I love that series. I love the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide series. I love humor. In fact, I have a lot of humor in my vampire novel, To Touch the Sun, and I love the humor of situations and such. And so I was really inspired by the Stainless Steel Rat series. And Trouble is about two brothers, and they may like each other, they may not, but they're both kind of shady characters. Trouble is a sort of character. It's Trouble and Bear. Bear has finally decided to give up his shady ways, and he's become the sheriff of a town called Jeffers on the planet Xyz. Trouble blows into town one day because he's got a scam he wants Bear to take part of. And as Bear says, whenever there's a tornado, Trouble's in the middle of it. He's got that kind of personality. So I wanted to have this kind of, I love the buddy movies and things like that. I love that kind of, if you have two disparate personalities that kind of grade against each other, but there's something there that also connects them. And I love the humor in that. So I love to explore humor with dialogue and things like that.
Let's talk about some of the technical aspects about ebook novels. Have you yourself uploaded the document, and what can you tell us about cover design and the text, and how did that work for you?
As I say, I wrote Trouble a while ago. I had been trying to, that was one of the things I offered that one agent, and he liked it enough, but not enough. I decided to go to the ebook format. It was basically an experiment. You hear so much now about people going and self-publishing on ebooks. I went on Amazon Kindle, and I wanted to see how it's done. So it was basically, I used this as a way to see how you do upload a book and such. It's fairly simple. If you go to Amazon Kindle, they pretty much have it all set up for you. And they even, if you have a problem, you can contact people and, get all sorts of information on that. I know there are it's such a growing industry now. I'm sure you find that in other companies as well. But I found it fairly easy once I can't describe. There were some initial glitches that I think were more on my end than their end, but once you're actually doing it, it's easier than you think it is. As far as cover design, I hear this, and I think it probably is a good idea to have somebody do the cover for you. And you can do that through Kindle, but the designs I saw weren't really that fascinating. So what I ended up doing was I made my own cover. I like it. I think it looks kind of cool. But, and other people have complimented on it. It's kind of a wild and crazy cover. It's kind of along the lines of a Terry Gilliam, if you remember, from Monty Python. And I took, because I'm not the best drawer, but I took photographs and I kind of collage sort of thing. And then I scanned it and then I put it on Amazon through there. I put it, as part of the package. I would do it a lot more carefully next time. I was kind of in a rush. And I'll be honest, like I said, this is one big experiment for me. I personally would prefer to work with a publisher. That's why I was happy to finally find somebody who could publish my vampire novel, which, it's so close to my heart, and I've been trying to find somebody for so long. I have 4 books in the series, and then a spin-off of a couple of paranormal investigators, and I really want the series to go. But I want to have a professional publisher doing it, because it's so hard when you're trying to write, market, and publish it, and do the mechanics of publishing. That's really hard to do. And people can do it, and there are people who swear by self-publishing, but I think it helps to have somebody whose main focus is publishing, because your main focus is writing and marketing or writing whatever. If you have somebody like an agent whose main focus is to get your name out there and to a publisher, that's so much simpler. Yeah, you got to pay him some money, but that's the way it goes.
Is one of your series Vampires Most Wanted? Is that part?
No, that was actually, that's a book that I wrote. I originally wrote the book Chicago's Most Wanted. The Most Wanted series is from Potomac Publishers. That's their signature series. And I originally wrote Chicago's Most Wanted. I think it was 2005 it was published. They approached me for another book in the series, to do another book in the series. And at the time, that's when I was trying to find a home To Touch the Sun. And so I figured, well, why not offer vampires? Because there's a lot more than I ever expected regarding vampires and the subject of vampires. And these Most Wanted books are set up so that you have, 21, 40-something chapters, and each chapter has 10 entries in it. And, you like, for example, in my Chicago's book, I have a chapter on the Cubs, and I have the chapter on gangsters, and I have a chapter on ghosts, even local ghosts, and each of those chapters have entries, and you write a little thing on there. I had a feeling you could do that with vampires, and it turns out you could. And so what I wanted to do with that was hopefully have something to kind of put my foot in the door with to help sell To Touch the Sun. And I think it kind of helped. It certainly got me in marketing Vampires Most Wanted. It got me into areas and places that helped me find a home for To Touch the Sun.
We'll be back with more of Eddie's interview with Laura right after this. Welcome back to In Print Radio. Eddie Resner is talking with author Laura Enright.
Now, one of my favorite genres is gritty stories about Chicago. Tell us about Chicago's Most Wanted Top 10.
And it's kind of like that's their deal is Most Wanted, the Top 10 book of. And I kind of cheated a little because, in my opinion, these aren't. I can't say this these buildings are the biggest, best, or this is the best thing that ever happened to the Cubs or whatever. But what I tried to do is I would choose a chapter, and then I would try to come up with some interesting trivia on it, and it was basically me presenting it to the audience, and I wasn't worried about whether or not it was the biggest or the best. For example, in the skyscraper chapter, I put the home insurance building as the first one because I think it was actually torn down in the 1890s or something, but that was only like 13 stories high. But it was the first building that showed that they could actually build that high. Prior to that, and it was because, I think it was Jennings, he discovered a way to do the skeletal structure the steel frame construction that helped these buildings grow much larger. And that's what Chicago needed at the time. And so even though it was only 13 stories high, I thought it was a fascinating story in that, and that's kind of what led to the Sears Tower and everything, so I put that as number one. So that's,
Otis had something to do with that also. He's the fellow that designed and invented the elevator, and the elevators helped.
Oh, definitely. And then, all these, it opened up to glass, to all this glass that they could suddenly have, because before it had to be very boxy. The other thing I found interesting was a lot of that architecture, that steel frame construction stuff was learned in the Civil War, in building bridges. And in fact, I think it was Jennings who was in the Civil War. I don't know if he was a major or something, but that's where he learned it, which I thought was kind of interesting. Were it not for the Civil War, were it not for the fire, we might not have what we had today.
Well, some of your chapter titles are Titans of the Town, the Mayors, Architecture, Politics, Skyscrapers, Disasters. How many mayors can you go back by memory, starting with
Honestly,
our present mayor?
Not a lot. I love the dailies just because of the whole empire thing. I know, people love the dailies, people hate the dailies, but you can't deny they love the town, whatever they did, and you can't deny how enjoyable it was to listen to them sometimes. I do have I have a little chapter on funny sayings from Chicago, and the dailies are featured in there. I'm trying to think of some of the interesting things. I think it was Carter Harrison II. He was a mayor during the Columbian Exposition, and they had an agreement with the dark side of Chicago that there would be no crime committed during the day, during the Columbian Exposition, so that all these people could go and enjoy themselves. And then at night, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted, and if they were arrested, they would be let go. And it was a kind of a deal that Carter Harrison struck with the darker element in Chicago. And he was actually kind of beloved, oddly enough, for every facet of Chicago, from the cops to the criminals to all of them. They kind of liked him a lot. But again, he had to do some pretty dirty dealings.
Well, my father was a Democratic precinct captain when the first mayor got elected, and I could recall some of the other names, a lot of Irish names, as you can guess. Kelly, Kennelly, and several others, and Big Jim Thompson goes way back to the Al Capone days in the 20s.
He was a mayor, and then they elected somebody else, and then he was mayor again.
I believe that's correct. That's correct.
He went off and went on a fishing boat or something, and then he came back and became mayor.
What are some of the disasters that you listed in the book?
Well, of course, the Eastland Disaster, which is particularly fascinating. It's interesting, too, that the Cunard Shipping Company, they're the same ones who built the Titanic, or were responsible for the Titanic, so actually, the Eastland was kind of like the sister ship of the Titanic. And it's something that's very sad, because it didn't necessarily have to happen. But it was one of those things where they rewrote the policies so that they could make, okay, we can have these many more people on board. And we can have this, they didn't structure the top deck that well, so it made it that much more liable to tip over. And that's all it did, really, was tip over in the river. But because of the way it happened, so many people died. They were caught in the lower decks, and they fell into the river and drowned that way. And it's something that really shouldn't have happened, that didn't need to happen. It's very sad.
Well, part of the tragedy is most of those people are from the same company, because it was kind of a company
the same neighborhoods,
outing.
Too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had neighborhoods where they had the black crepe on doors all across the town. They had one story where one of the churches had coffins on. They had to have special, on the first pews, because there were so many coffins in there. And then I think when this happened, I think it was Marshall Field donated some trucks to take the bodies to the morgue, because they ran out of the regular morgue trucks.
Many of us are interested in the Columbian Exposition. What can you tell us about your writing on that topic?
It's kind of interesting. It was a totally different mindset. I kind of look at, for example, the fire really changed a lot. The fire in the Columbian Exposition kind of showed what Chicago was capable of. Prior to that, it was very much a town of just, let's work kind of thing. Nobody was really that concerned with culture. Along came the fire. It kind of made everyone pause and stop and think, and And when it was rebuilt, you had a mindset almost like I said, they had to pause and stop and think and say, okay, let's try rebuilding, but in a certain way, or let's have a little more thought here. And it was almost like Chicago suddenly realized what it could do. They didn't think the exposition would work in Chicago. Nobody believed that they could actually do it, especially after, it was fairly close to the fire, not that close, but it was fairly close to the fire. Everyone doubted that they would do it, but they let them do it. And it turned out to be the most important, or the biggest fair. I think it was ultimately the biggest fair that ever was. One of the things I found interesting with that, with the whole concept of the World's Fair, but especially with that, it was around the time that electrical lights were really becoming popular. And I just thought, can you imagine being like some farm guy in Iowa, maybe not in a town that was wired, come to the Chicago, and you see this white city that's just blazed in lights at night. I mean, that must have really been surprising. Now we go on the computer, we can see, a Japanese tea garden, we can see this, we can see that. But back then, you didn't have that. So it had to be just absolutely amazing to see some of these exhibits.
At that time, there was a competition between AC or alternating electricity and DC, and the fellow that suffered the most was Tesla, who you hear from.
Tesla, that's such an interesting story, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a shame that didn't, because he was actually really a genius. But one of the other thing I liked, the other story I loved to tell with that was they had a Colored People's Day, because the local, they were complaining that it all seemed geared to whites, And when they had the African exhibit, it was like an exhibit of some African folks from the bush. They didn't talk about the culture of Africa and the great cultures of the many states of Africa. So they were kind of disgusted. And there were a lot of black leaders who wanted to boycott the fair. And they were very angry at Frederick Douglass, because on this it was called Jubilee Day, but it was a black folk day. They had watermelons at the front gate and fried chicken set up, and it was just very kind of a disgusting. It backfired, basically, or they didn't do what they should have done. But Frederick Douglass, nonetheless, who was most people know was the former slave who educated himself and became a huge name in civil rights, he decided to accept the invitation to speak on this day because he thought it was incredibly important that a voice be heard. And now you took advantage of whatever you could. You took the chance. And he's like 75 years old. It's broiling hot. He's out there talking. And in his speech, he mentions, you know what? We bled and died for this country. Why won't you let us be a part of this country? That's basically what he was saying. And I just found that such a stirring thought, such a stirring image and I've always loved Frederick Douglass. Ever since I was a little kid, I did a report on him. And I think there should be more taught about Frederick Douglass. He's fascinating. But I just love the thought of this. It had to have been so powerful at the time.
Is Chicago's Most Wanted the top 10 available in Kindle and paperback?
Yes, it is.
By the way, which are the top lists that you rate number one? Do you have your favorite in the Chicago top 10? And what's the second?
Like what list I like to work on?
Yeah. Well, the chapters you have, could you list them as with respect to your favorite personal taste?
I'm trying to think
1, 2, and 3?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I'm so bad with that. I'm so bad with lists. I found the chapter on the gangsters interesting. It's kind of a shame that Chicago has to have, one of the things it's known for is gangsters. And in fact, in a later book in the Vampire series, I mentioned somebody says something to the effect like, we have one of the grandest cities here and all anyone knows about it is Al Capone. But one of the things I thought interesting about the gangster industry was to see how it kind of evolved from where it was in the late 1800s to where it is now. And you do see a definite evolution, especially when Torrio and Capone got a hold of the big prize. So I thought that was kind of fun to do. I like doing being a fan of the paranormal, I enjoyed doing the ghost story chapter. That was kind of fun. And there's so many more out there. there's a movie called White Noise, and on it they have special features, and they went to the Excalibur Club, speaking of the Eastland disaster, and they were doing what's a digital recording, and you're supposed to be able to pick up ghostly voices if it's all silent, and you just let the recorders roll. So they picked up a voice, and there were three things they said, but one of them was, my ship, I'll stay. And they believe it might be the captain of the Eastland, who at the time when the Eastland was tipped over, he was trying to get them to stop trying to break into the decks to get people out, because he didn't want anyone to ruin his ship. And so there's some, the theory is that maybe he's guilty or something, so he's hanging out because he's guilty. So I've been wanting to buy a digital tape recorder just to do it at my apartment, but then I'm thinking, do I really want to know? Do I want anyone talking? Another really interesting thing about the ghost things, and one of the fun things about Chicago's Most Wanted was I was able to take a look at some of these stories from a different angle. We all know about the Dillinger deal, and the Biograph Theater. And his ghost is supposed to haunt the alley by the Biograph Theater. And so if you go down there, you're supposed to see some guy running and he falls. And that's kind of what happened with Dillinger that day.
Stay tuned for more of Eddie's interview with Laura right after this. We're back with Eddie Resner talking with Laura Enright on In Print Radio.
Somebody, I think his name is J. Robert Nash, Tom, in my reading, he posited this theory that it might not have been Dillinger who was caught that day. Now, that's a kind of a well-known theory that actually it wasn't Dillinger. And there are some things when he got to the morgue that differ from, for example, I think the body in the morgue, I think it was the body in the morgue had a rheumatoid heart condition and Dillinger didn't, or vice versa. It was something, supposedly different color eyes, something like that. So the theory was that there was a local guy in town who looked similar to Dillinger. And this was around the time that Dillinger had plastic surgery. And that's why they needed the woman in red to point him out, because that was his pal, and they were going to the movie together. They told this poor woman, you know what, if you point him out, we won't deport you back to Poland. She was a brothel operator, so she agreed to do it. The theory is that they suckered this one guy, this two-bit gangster, two-bit hood in town, to go to the movies with her that night, and then she pointed this guy out as Dillinger. And before anything could happen, the guy's on the ground dead. So nobody knows for sure if it was Dillinger or not. They ended up deporting this poor woman anyway, so she was comeuppance. But I love the idea of thinking that what if this ghost isn't actually Dillinger replaying this, but actually the poor guy who was suckered into being shot that night because somebody pointed him out as Dillinger. And I thought, wow, that's kind of creepy to me. I find that even creepier than the idea that Dillinger is running around.
Well, let's find out a little bit more about your personal life. What was your schooling? Where'd you work? Where do you live for most of your life?
Well, I grew up in the O'Hare area. I grew up in Harwood Heights, which is spitting distance from Chicago. My grandfather built a bar around the Harlem Foster area, and we grew up right across from the bar. So, and then my dad had a business in the same area. I'm always I don't know why I'm kind of proud of that, but I just like the idea that my grandfather built a bar in 1930. He ran the bar. It got out of our hands in the 1970s. So I grew up in that area, and I went to Maine South High School in Park Ridge. I was in the one area that was districted for that. I lived in Chicago. I moved around a little, and then I went back. I now live in Park Ridge, which is a curious thing because I didn't live there when I went to school when I could have used it. I work at the Park Ridge Library, and I've worked there for 14 years. I'm in the circulation department, and I like it a lot, part-time. I've had I used to work for Pioneer Press, but I quit that in April, I believe it was, because the company's the Sun Times company is kind of not a very fun company to work for anymore, not a very good company to work for anymore. So I decided it was time for us to list. They wanted to make a transition. I used to work on the North Shore. I used to work in Glenview. I worked for the North Shore editions of Pioneer Press. And they decided they wanted to move everything. They wanted to close all the suburban newspaper offices and move everything downtown to the Sun-Times building. And I didn't want to make the transition, so I left.
Do you attend any conferences or seminars? Are you active with the writing groups in the Chicagoland area? There's so many of them.
I'm becoming more active the last few years. I'm a member of the Chicago Writers Association. That's where I found out about this. I should have been, I kind of consider myself 10 years behind in my development in a lot of ways. And so I should have been more active and things like that. And I also didn't go to college, so that would have helped a lot had I gone to college. But so I'm getting more and more involved in this, and it helps. My friend Stu Shea actually was the one who turned me on to the publishers for Chicago's Most Wanted. He's a local writer in town. He wrote 1960s Most Wanted and Rock and Roll's Most Wanted. He also wrote, I believe it's called Wrigley Field, the Unauthorized Biography. So he kind of turned me on to publishers when I was complaining about the fact that I couldn't figure out how to break into the field. And I was more interested in fiction at that time. And he was the one who said, well, why don't you try a nonfiction thing? And he gave me the name of his editor, which is like gold, when you're a writer. And so I was able to suggest Chicago's Most Wanted, but that really helped me break through. Yeah, so it's like I'm trying to get more involved in that.
Has this influenced your writing at all, or are you pretty much independent on what you choose, what genre, when, and is there a variety of books?
There's definitely a variety. I'm very much into sci-fi and fantasy. Chicago's Most Wanted was a complete, that came out of nowhere. I'd never done anything like that. Like I said, I never went to college, so I didn't even do a thesis like that, a research thesis. I've done research for fiction novels, and I did a lot of research for an Asian dragon novel I'm trying to look for a home for. But I've never done anything of that nature. It was amazing to do for the first time, and it was a lot of fun. When you're in it, it's a nightmare, but then whatever it is, 5 years down the line, it's like, oh, that was fun after all. So kind of my thinking is whatever gets my interest now. I would never have thought to try that had he not suggested it. Now I have a couple ideas for nonfiction books. I would try, I'm not that into mysteries or, as far as fiction goes, mysteries or real life, things like that, but I wouldn't mind trying it as well. I'd love to write also a history of my own family. I think there's some interesting stories there with the Enrights. So, yeah, I'd be interested in trying anything.
Well, maybe you'll find out that that tavern used to be a speakeasy way back when or something.
There is a funny story because this was around the time when Howard Heights was growing up, starting to be built up. And so my grandfather, the way he had the tavern is you can't see it driving down Foster Avenue. So a lot of the workers, like the carpenters and the electricians who were building these houses, would go and spend about, the afternoon at the bar, and the Con Ed who's driving by, the guy would never see him, so...
We'll be back with more of Eddie's interview with Laura right after this. We're back with Eddie Resner talking with Laura Enright on In Print Radio.
What would you say is your most difficult part of writing for you?
The attention lately. I'm actually trying to hold on to jobs and write at the same time. And when I was working at Pioneer, I was working 60 hours a week between Park Ridge Library and Pioneer. It would be wonderful if I get to a point where I can actually devote my time to the writing. But in most cases, I'm like most other people. You have to find time to write. And it's hard to juggle that amount of time, especially when you're working on a research thing and you have to research and then write it in digestible things. But even with fiction, it's really hard to focus sometimes.
Do you like to do research?
I love doing the research, yeah. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
What are some of your most productive sources? Libraries?
I love libraries. I really do love libraries. People keep saying about how they're a thing of the past or they're going to go bye-bye pretty soon. And it's just kind of silly. There are so many people who still need it, so many people who can't afford all these fancy internet connections and such. They go I see them every day, so, and I would trust a book in a library more than I would, like, a website. You put in Google whatever you want to, like cats, and you'll get 50,000 hits or 50,000 websites, and then you got to screen out which website is reliable. The books have hopefully been edited and proofed like 2 or 3 times. My book was proofed 3 times, and I'm sure there's still some, pops that they didn't catch. So I would so much more trust a book than I would. But even the book sometimes. It changes things that were thought of 10 years ago. New information might have been discovered. And so that changes the story. I mean, on such a small level, Dean O'Banion is actually, he was termed Dion O'Banion, I think it was, and his name was spelled D-I-O-N in so many books. Well, then there was a book that came out a few years ago, and it's on his grave. His name is actually Dean, D-E-A-N-E. I think it's E at the end. So for years and years, he's known as Dion, D-I-O-N, but his name is actually spelled totally different. So it's like that happens no matter what.
Well, what are some of your views on the current status of the literary business world? E-books versus traditional editors, reader acceptance of various genres, mystery and romance.
There's so much romance out there. Control
the market and the reading audience.
Unfortunately, I don't have a romantic bone in my body, so I can't cash in. But, it's a really tough business to get into. If I were to tell somebody who wants to start writing, I would say, first of all, figure out what you want to do. Are you fine with the fanzine world, or do you want to make a living off of this? If you want to make a living off of this, and it's fine to if you want to just write for your pleasure and, maybe self-publish some things, that's great. If you want to make a living off of this, 90% of your time is going to be devoted to marketing and getting your name out there. And until you can maybe afford a publicist, or maybe, you get into a publisher that's willing to put that effort out there. It's so hard to break into now because so many small publishers have been bought out by large publishers, and they're not interested. They're not interested in taking chance on the small name. They want the big guns right away. So that's why a lot of people are turning to self-publishing, and that business has become so sophisticated. At one time it was really looked down upon, and I think it's still kind of looked down upon, but there's so much more sophistication now in the way of marketing and such, and editing. It's a lot more careful. It's almost like a publisher, so that a lot of people are turning that route because they don't have anywhere else to go. It's kind of like the garage bands of the 60s and the 80s and putting out their own albums because they have nowhere else to go because the big guys won't do it. So you have to be willing to accept the fact that, are you willing to self-publish? Are you willing to have only so many sales? Are you willing, or, are you willing to accept that thing? And some people can be wildly successful with self-publishing, but sometimes it's not that. So a person getting into this field really has to think about all these things. That with my 2 books with the Most Wanted series, it was a smaller publisher, and they didn't have the money to get into to the sort of marketing that might have made it even more successful. And a lot of the marketing I had to do on my own, and I had to travel all over to libraries and give talks and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting time right now because the technology is out there for people to take advantage of self-publishing and becoming powerful in their own way. You really do have to make a decision. How much of your life are you willing to devote to it?
Well, do you formalize the plan and make a spreadsheet or a list or with dates and goals? Set some goals?
I kind of fly by the seat of my pants sometimes, and I really shouldn't. And that's another thing I would tell people. Like I said, in a lot of ways, I'm 10 years behind in my development. If I were to do Chicago's Most Wanted over again, I would do things a lot differently. This was put out in 2005, for example. Right now, I'm in a position now where I can sit and concentrate on that. When I got that project, and before that, when I was trying to look for a home for other novels and such, I wasn't really in the position physically or mentally, or not physically, but in my life or mentally to sit down and concentrate on the business aspect of it. And I really should have, but I just didn't. So now I'm trying to be a little more careful with that, but it's still hard, and especially, like I said, when you're holding down 2 jobs or 1 job even, Even to get this interview set up, it was trying to find a day that I wasn't working because I work on the weekends. So that kind of thing does throw you off on being more organized. If I ever get to a point where this is my one source of income, it would be a lot easier because you can, devote all your time to that.
Do you have any travel plans for the near future?
No, I would love to go to Kentucky. There's a Southern Kentucky Book Fest that I attended this past April. And again, getting back to how strange it can be, I drove down there on Friday, attended the book fest on Saturday, and then drove back on Sunday. That's how weird it can be when you don't have an easy schedule. But I would love to go back there because it's such a beautiful area. It would be great since the novel is coming out in January, and then I'll put more news on that about my website. Since the novel is coming out in January and it's being published in Nottingham, England, it would be nice if I could go back to England. I was there in the 80s. Offhand, right now, I don't have that many more any travel plans. It'll probably be something that'll come up at the last minute, and I'll have to figure out how to do it.
Well, I just returned from the New England states, and I have to recommend Bar Harbor, Maine to you. There's a very active literary community out there. And
I'd love to go to that area because that looks beautiful.
Samuel Clemens retired out in that part of the world at one time.
Yeah, I'd love to do a drive. I'd love to do a drive around the country. Get into trouble, do all sorts of things.
Thank you very much for all of your information and your wonderful books. I've enjoyed everything with a little favoritism towards Chicago's Most Wanted because of my background, and I compliment you on your success.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for having me.